Hello, my name's Mike, or Taz if you please, and on behalf of Dr. Sean and Deb, I'd like to welcome you to Jester Politics video on the state's Article 5 convention. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, there are two ways to amend the Constitution. First, and the only way that's been used so far, is for Congress, both houses of Congress, by two-thirds majority vote, propose an amendment to the states, and then if three-quarters of the states ratify the proposed amendment, it becomes part of the Constitution. The second method, and the one that's never been used, is to call for a state's convention, or what they call an Article 5 convention. Under this method, two-thirds of the state's legislatures, not the governor, but just the legislatures, have to call for a state's convention. If that happens, then the delegates from the states meet for a convention, propose amendments, and then three-quarters of the states have to ratify them before they become effective. Over the past few years, I've noticed that a movement calling for a state's convention is starting to gain at least a little bit of traction, and it seems to be fueled by the frustration with the lack of term limits on Congress. Now, you may be asking, why don't we just pass a federal law or each state pass their own laws placing term limits on senators and members of the House of Representatives? Well, that was tried in 1995. And the Supreme Court ruled in U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton that the only way you can impose term limits is through a constitutional amendment. Now, I think most people will agree that there's more than a few people in Congress that have overstayed their welcome, to put it mildly. 54 congressmen have spent 20 years or more in the House, and 29 senators have been there for 18 years or more. Senator Grassley has been there for 44, and Mitch McConnell's for better than 40. But before jumping on the Article 5 convention bandwagon, I think we all need to ask, is the remedy worse than the disease? The Constitution places no limit on the scope of what a convention can do. If they want to rewrite the whole Constitution, they can do that. Now, people who are calling for a state's convention are arguing that they can restrict the scope of the convention through state legislation. I'm not so sure that's true. First, the Supreme Court has consistently held that state legislators and the federal government cannot place any restrictions on the powers granted by the Constitution. In other words, if the language of the Constitution does not restrict something that is explicitly allowed by the Constitution, then it's beyond the legislative powers of the state or federal government to do so. Perfect example of this is the Supreme Court striking down the attempt to impose term limits on congressmen through legislative activity because senators and congressmen are created by the Constitution, and therefore only the Constitution can restrict their terms of service. I think it follows from that since an Article 5 convention is created by the Constitution, only the Constitution can limit the scope of the Article 5 convention. In other words, once convened, the Article 5 convention can rewrite the whole Constitution regardless of what restrictions are purportedly put on it by the states. I think this interpretation is supported by our Constitutional Convention of 1787. That convention was called with the explicit purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation, which was the governing document, the first constitution, if you will, of our country. However, after settling on the rules of the convention, the first order of business was when Edmund Randolph of Virginia introduced James Madison's Virginia Plan, which was the basis of what is now our Constitution, and didn't amend the Articles of Confederation, but in fact scuttled them and replaced them with an entirely new form of government. Now, there's no doubt that adopting the Constitution was probably the greatest event in this nation's history. However, it was still a runaway convention that greatly exceeded the scope of its authority. Fortunately, the people at the Constitutional Convention were giants among men. Franklin, Washington, Hamilton, Madison. Do we have those today? I'm not so sure. I mean, take a look at our political leadership. Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Crenshaw, Bobart, Omar, Pelosi, AOC, Pete Buttigieg, Newsom, Pritzker, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris. These are no Washingtons and Franklins. I guess the question everybody has to answer for themselves is, do they think the risk of having a runaway convention where our liberties could be significantly narrowed, if not done away with, is worth trying to impose term limits on some congressmen and senators? With that, I'll bid you have a great day. From Jester Politics, I hope you return. Bye.